After the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah was the last Israelite nation standing. Worship of Yahweh was preserved by the temple priests in Jerusalem, and they continued to preach the need for the children of Abraham to return to proper worship of God. However, the kings of Judah had difficulty in retaining these proper religious practices, which the Bible blames for their ultimate fall. This is what the Lord Almighty says: "Cut down the trees and build siege ramps against Jerusalem. This city must be punished. It is filled with oppression. As a well pours out its water, so she pours out her wickedness. Violence and destruction resound in her. Her sickness and wounds are ever before me. Take warning, O Jerusalem, or I will turn away from you and make your land desolate so no one can live in it." This part of the story begins with the fall of the Assyrian Empire. After the death of Ashurbanipal in 627, the Assyrian Empire fell into civil war between his sons, Ashur-etil-ilan and Sin-shar-ishkun. Shinshar had raised an army in Babylon and defeated his brother in Nineveh in 626. But that same year, a local dynasty rose up in Babylon and crowned Nabopolassar as king of Babylon. He allied with numerous enemies of the Assyrians such as the Cimmerians, the Scythians, and the most importantly for foreshadowing, the Medes. Many cities around the Near East wanted independence from Assyrian rule, including the rump state of Judah, which had been reduced to the land around the city of Jerusalem. The capital of Nineveh fell to the Babylonians in 611, which triggered the Egyptians into action. The Assyrian Empire had been weakening for decades, which allowed some of the larger vassal states such as Egypt to assert more control over the Levant. They preferred to deal with the weak Assyria rather than a strong Babylon. So they sent an army northward in 609 to aid the remnants of the Assyrian government, but they were halted by a small Judean army led by King Josiah, who had sided with the Babylonians. Unfortunately, the Judeans were defeated at the Battle of Megiddo, and King Josiah was killed in combat, allowing the Egyptian forces to pass through. Josiah was briefly succeeded by his son Jehoaz, but Jehoaz would be captured and taken hostage by the Egyptians, who replaced him with his brother Jehoiakim. Despite this victory against Judah, the Egyptians were defeated by the Babylonians at Carchemish in 605, and retreated back across the Sinai. As the Babylonian army under the command of the new king Nebuchadnezzar II passed through, he stopped by Jerusalem, where he won the fealty of Jehoiakim. In order to prevent the destruction of Jerusalem, Jehoiakim handed over a number of treasures from the temple to the Babylonians, along with taking a number of hostages from the royal family and Judean nobility, among them being the future prophet Daniel. Jehoiakim wasn't interested in restoring proper temple worship, for which he was criticized by the prophet Uriah, whom the king had killed. His main interest was in getting out from under the heel of Babylon, and he attempted to do so just a few years later. In 601, the Babylonians attempted a failed invasion of Egypt, which disrupted Babylonian control over the Levant. Jehoiakim re-swore allegiance to the Egyptians, but in 598 the Babylonians laid siege to the city and regained control. Jehoiakim died during the siege and was briefly succeeded by his own son, Jeconiah. After 3 months, the Babylonians replaced him with his uncle, Zedekiah. Zedekiah had the prophet Jeremiah as an advisor, who warned him to avoid the same mistakes his brother, father, and the final kings of Israel in the north had made. Do not join your idolatrous neighbors in revolts against the reigning power. But he did so anyways. He joined an alliance led by Egypt against the Babylonians. This brought the Babylonians to Jerusalem in 588 and laid siege to the city, which finally fell in 586. The city walls were torn down and the temple was destroyed, with its remaining treasures brought back to Babylon, along with the remnants of the Judean elites, including King Zedekiah and the prophet Jeremiah. Other towns and fortresses in the region were destroyed. The kingdom of Judah became the Yahudah province, with its capital relocated to Mitzpah, and one of the few remaining Judean elites, Gedaliah, being named governor. He wanted to rebuild Judah into a prosperous land by working with the Babylonians, and during his brief tenure, new farms and vineyards were planted. However, he was assassinated by Ishmael ben Nethaniah, a member of the royal house of Judah, probably as revenge for collaborating with the Babylonian occupiers. This assassination resulted in a sizable number of Jews going into exile in Egypt, despite being warned by the prophet Jeremiah not to do so, who feared leaving the promised land empty. The Babylonian Captivity is a very important event for Jewish identity. Up until that point in Jewish history, being a Jew was tied to living in the Promised Land, but suddenly a large portion of them weren't, and so they had to come to grips with the covenants made by the patriarchs, and what it meant when God seemingly didn't keep his promises. Their land had been granted by Jehovah upon specific conditions. It was obviously necessary to have accurate copies of the law given to Moses. What the Babylonian exile gave to the Old Testament was a full stop, a chance to look at Israel as a single entity, a finished thing. From behind the bars of their prison, the past seemed quite a different place. Numerous books of the Bible were written or partially written during the captivity. The books of Jeremiah, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, the early chapters of Ezra, the book of Tobit, Judith, and Lamentations as well. Establishing the religious and cultural norms of the Jews was a very important part of the exile. Being surrounded by foreign gods and cultures means that you need to codify your own religion, history, and cultural practices, or else face apostasy. We should also look at some of the biblical stories taking place during the exile, many of which are found in the book of Daniel, named for one of the exiles taken into captivity. God had given Daniel great wisdom and insight, which caught the attention of Nebuchadnezzar, who brought him into his court, where he interpreted the dreams of the king. The importance of retaining your faith in the face of societal pressure is shown in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3, when the king had a golden idol built and demands everyone worship it, but 3 Jews refused to do so. The king had them thrown into a fiery furnace, but they were unharmed. The message being that God will be with you even in the toughest of challenges. This message is echoed again in the story of Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6, when advisors of King Darius tricked the king into banning the worship of other gods. Daniel is arrested and thrown into the lion's den, but God protects him and he is released the next day. Another lesson taken to heart by Jews comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who had also been taken into exile. In Jeremiah 29, he writes a letter to the exiles to give them advice on what to do while kept away from their homeland. He tells them to build homes, plant gardens, and start families. He tells them to teach their children valuable skills and become useful to the Babylonians. Firstly, he's telling the Jews that this isn't going to be a short affair, and therefore they shouldn't wait for life to go back to normal before becoming productive. By learning valuable skills, they become useful to the Babylonians. Not only does this make their captors less likely to cause them harm while in exile, it also builds up useful trades for them to take back to Judah. He doesn't encourage revolt or undermining the country you're living in. His message is, be a polite guest. Being a Jew is no longer just about where you live, but about how you live. When you look at the history of the Jews and how they have typically lived and survived, this isn't just advice for the time period. This became advice for all time. The Babylonian captivity shows something amazing about the Jewish people, their ability to adapt and survive. The Jewish elites were a minority people being held in a foreign land. All the while back in their homeland, they were occupied by a much stronger foreign power. In this kind of situation, most peoples either assimilate into the population they are being held in and eventually lose all distinctive features to the point where history forgets they ever existed, or they resist assimilation to the point of self-destruction. The lessons of Jeremiah, as well as the book of Daniel, offer a third way. You assimilate as much as necessary when it comes to unimportant things such as the way you dress or the names you give your children, but you hold firm on what's important, such as your faith. Jeremiah told the Jews to assimilate, while Daniel told them where to draw the line. The ability to do this is why there is a continuity between ancient worshippers of Yahweh and modern ones, while all the other religions from the region have died out. If you're interested in learning more about Jewish history in my style, then you can check out my playlist right here. However, if you're interested in learning more about Jewish history from a channel dedicated to it, then I would suggest checking out the channel Unpacked. They have a bunch of videos about Jewish culture and history. Very great stuff. I would suggest subscribing to them if you're interested. I would like to thank my patrons for helping make this video possible. Your support allows me to make videos like this instead of catering to the algorithm. My sources for this video are listed down in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.